When you hear the phrase FMV games, what kind of picture immediately comes to mind? I bet it isn't flattering. Even if you haven't played any yourself, you probably already know that full-motion video games have an absolutely infamous reputation, whether that's from the contemporary critical consensus of when they were first released, or from many years later via YouTube osmosis.
Excuse me. My friend and I were wondering if you could help us out a little bit.
Yeah, help us out a little.
Pick your pejorative of choice. Crappy, janky, cheesy, bloated, unintuitive, boring, overacted, unfun. Not to mention the widespread belief that FMV titles were almost instantly made obsolete as soon as they appeared on the scene thanks to the rise of early 3D game tech. The consensus around these games could not be clearer. FMV games just suck. Nowadays, the kindest thing you'll find anyone say about FMV games is that they were a well-intentioned but ultimately fruitless evolutionary dead-end for game design, which is really just another way of saying that the genre's sole redeeming qualities are its technological merits. A cool use of live actors and blue screen technology as a stopgap before 3D rendering took off, but without many redeeming qualities beyond that. And as old-school point-and-click grognards know all too well, FMV games are often slandered as one of the prime culprits behind the so-called death of the adventure game. As the story goes, adventure games were well past their peak popularity and were quickly falling out of fashion by the mid to late 1990s, suggesting that the FMV craze was partly an ill-fated last-ditch attempt at using technological trickery to try and keep a dying genre on life support. Even though there were plenty of FMV games outside of the adventure genre, the slow death of the adventure game and the rise and fall of FMV are two events that have become indelibly linked in many players' minds. A legend even among old heads like me who were around to watch as this all happened in real time.
Legend. A legend is nothing but fiction. Someone tells it, someone else remembers, everybody passes it on.
But what if I told you that FMV games rule, actually? With the benefit of hindsight, it becomes clearer with each passing year that they were never just a worthless, inbred mutant offshoot of how games are quote-unquote supposed to be. Some FMV games are good, and some are bad, just like any other genre. In fact, I have a very strong hunch that if you were to make a critical power rankings tier list of 80s and 90s FMV games, and then if you were to do the same breakdown for a popular contemporary genre, like, say, roguelike deck builders of the 2020s, I'd be willing to bet real cash money that there would be a comparable ratio of hits and misses to the heyday of FMV games. Which doesn't even tell the full story, because of course taste is always a subjective thing. Many consider a game like Night Trap to be a certified FMV stinker, when others will tell you that it really isn't, just like how there's a range of passionate and contested opinions for a game like, say, Pathologic. So it should perhaps go without saying, the best of the best FMV games are absolutely no-holds-barred masterpieces, and deserve to stand proudly alongside the classics of any other genre you'd care to name. And there's one FMV adventure game in particular that's long overdue for some retrospective reconsideration. Harvester.
Well, you've always been a kidder, Steve.
Just kidding. Unless it's actually true. Yeah, we recently replayed this one too, and I can confirm that Harvester is indeed so much more interesting, more fun to play, more subversive, and even more intelligent than its reputation suggests.
You'll rot your mind playing games like that. Don't you know people who watch violence become violent themselves?
That's bullshit, Mom.
But that's a story for another day. No, I'm talking of course about the game that's right in the title of this video. The iconic 1995 horror adventure Phantasmagoria, written and directed by none other than Sierra matriarch and King's Quest series maestro Roberta Williams. Williams was maybe the perfect choice to head up a project like this. She created Mystery House, considered to be the first ever graphic adventure game, not to mention one of the earliest horror games ever made. She also wrote and directed a very popular and well-received successor to Mystery House called The Colonel's Bequest, which is like a playable adventure game version of an Agatha Christie murder mystery. Which makes a cinematic horror thriller feel like a natural next step in this game design evolutionary lineage. Replaying Phantasmagoria in preparation for this video was such a great experience, much better than I had expected. It absolutely gave me a renewed appreciation not only for the tremendous accomplishment that is the game itself, but also for just how underappreciated Roberta Williams was, and still is, as a game designer and developer. So let's get into it. We're going to explore the ins and outs of Phantasmagoria and how it was developed, talk about why the game had such a legendarily controversial reputation, and delve into the ludo-narrative thematics that make it so much more profound and compelling to play than most people give it credit for. This is a story about horror, trauma, abuse, a loving marriage gone sour, and one woman's desperate quest for self-actualization in a world turned upside down. This is Roberta Williams' Phantasmagoria. Before we continue, I want to say thanks to NordVPN for sponsoring this video. I've been using VPN service for longer than I can remember by now. Now, most of you probably already know what a VPN service does. Whenever you do anything on the internet, your activity gets observed and logged by your internet service provider and is freely accessible to governments and all kinds of prying eyes. With a VPN like NordVPN, you use an application on your computer or smartphone that encrypts your data requests and sends them to your VPN service instead, who retrieves the data packets for you and then sends them back, also encrypted, to your device where it's decrypted. This means no ISP or government can see what it is you're requesting, and it's Nord's servers located in over 100 countries across the world that get the data your device wants instead of your ISP. The beauty of it is that NordVPN servers run on RAM only, exclusively temporary storage, which means that none of the data packages or requests you send ever get permanently stored anywhere. So even if a government comes and wants to subpoena data from them, no dice, because it just doesn't exist. Also, since Nord servers are located all across the world, you can also use it to circumvent region locks, for instance, to use streaming services based off a different country than you're in, just to name one of the many use cases. I've been relying on NordVPN for years now, and I find it fast, reliable, and customizable to my needs as a heavy PC user. Give it a try. You have a risk-free 30-day trial period in case you find it's not for you, and as a special offer through my partnership with NordVPN, you can get 4 months extra on a 2-year plan if you use the URL nordvpn.com/ragnar. So, thanks a lot again to NordVPN, and now I hope you enjoy the rest of the video. Actually, before we go any further, we should probably define terms first. There are lots of games that use live-action FMV in cutscenes but aren't actually FMV games. Star Wars Dark Forces 2 Jedi Knight being one famous and gloriously campy example.
Morgan Katar!
This is a game that has full motion video cutscenes but isn't an FMV game, because the rest of the experience takes place in 3D rendered environments. So when we discuss FMV games in this video, we're talking specifically about something like Gabriel Knight 2 The Beast Within, a game where both the main characters and the bulk of moment-to-moment action are depicted via live actors, usually filmed in front of a blue or green screen. And so, the story of Phantasmagoria begins as Adrienne Delaney and her husband Don, with their beloved cat Spaz in tow.
Oh, hi, Spaz. How you doing, huh?
Arrive at the palatial Gothic castle they've recently purchased in a picturesque coastal New England town. Adrienne is a successful published novel writer, and Don is a professional photographer. A real creative power couple, right? The vibe being established here is crystal clear. This narrative setup is already peak Stephen King before we've even seen a single spoopy image on screen. We soon learn that the mansion's former owner and inhabitant was the famous magician Zoltan Karnavash, a wealthy and world-renowned prestidigator who put on dazzling magic performances in the grand auditorium of his own estate. Yet, reading various documents and newspaper clippings found hidden around the castle and talking to the inhabitants of the nearby town paints a very different picture of the long-dead Zoltan. His life was shrouded in secrecy and sorrow, with each of his 5 wives dying mysterious and gruesome deaths in one ill-fated marriage after another. Until the man himself likewise came to a miserable and literally infernal end due to a freak accident during one of his stage shows, right in front of a packed house. And thus, the mansion stood empty for decades, until Adrienne and Don came to town.
We have to admit, this place is kind of strange.
Yeah, it's different. You know, I bet the guy that built this place must have been really bizarre.
Soon, this abstract allegory for how professional fixations can lead to the collapse of a marriage starts becoming very, very real. While exploring the castle's expansive grounds during her first day after arrival, Adrienne stumbles upon a sealed oaken box in a hidden chapel room. And just like the old myths go, curiosity gets the better of Pandora, and she inadvertently cracks open the metaphoric, or in this case literal, gates of hell. Adrienne now finds herself plunged into an unraveling nightmare scenario where she and Dawn begin reliving and reenacting horrors that bring to mind some ominous parallels to what befell Zoltan and his wives. Even more disturbing, Dawn seems to become increasingly unhinged and menacing towards Adrienne as the days pass and the narrative progresses, doing volatile whipsaws between loving tenderness, dismissive distraction, and angry condescension. Things get plenty violent and oppressive in the coming hours, but the initial 60 to 90 minutes of the game is intentionally structured as a placid and low-stakes gamble, so the player can explore the vast castle interior, chat with local townsfolk, and generally learn the lay of the land. The cozy vibe of this first hour of gameplay is excellent, and it's easy to get lost in the small moments. Like, just look at this absolutely adorable FMV idle animation that occurs when you interact with a couch or chair or have Adrienne sit down. It doesn't serve a ludological purpose in the strictest sense, no, but it is hugely endearing in a way that makes the player feel as though the game world is a real, lived-in space that has its own logic and set of rules. These little humanistic flourishes add a ton of unquantifiable charm to the vibe and world building of any game. This is exactly why Kojima spent all those millions of dollars to mocap Norman Reedus scratching his butt in Death Stranding. Yep, that's the second Kojima reference in this video already, and we're barely past the 10-minute mark. But remember, we're talking about an auteur game director using for-the-time bleeding-edge technology in order to mimic best-in-class cinematic presentation techniques and push the whole medium forward. This introductory 60 to 90 minute stretch in Phantasmagoria is plenty of playtime for the attentive player to start absorbing stray details and hints that leave you unable to shake the feeling that, even in this first chapter of the game, something just isn't quite right about this place. One of the main selling points of Phantasmagoria when it first came out was that this was such an epic cinematic event, packed with so much full motion video that it needed 7 CD-ROMs to contain the entire game, a whopping 5 whole gigabytes of data. And that really wasn't an exaggeration for the sake of marketing hype. Phantasmagoria was published by Sierra Online on August 24th, 1995, the exact same day that Microsoft released Windows 95 to the general public. And at that time, the hard drive capacity of your average home computer topped out at 1 gigabyte, maybe 2 gigs at the maximum for those beefy new Windows 95 PCs. The multi-disc release was absolutely necessary because the game itself was so FMV heavy that it was quite literally too big to be contained on an average PC hard drive. Each of the 7 discs contains a single chapter or day of the narrative, and the player is required to swap to the next disc at the end of each day in order to continue. Considering the 1995 release date, the FMV in Phantasmagoria is still pretty charming to experience firsthand, even some 30 years on. All of the human characters are portrayed by actors filmed in front of blue screens. Beyond that, pretty much everything else in terms of sets and the environment are CG rendered a la The Seventh Guest, another classic early FMV game. And given the reputation FMV games have of being unbearably cheesy, you might be surprised to learn that the acting performances in Phantasmagoria are actually pretty decent. Especially Victoria Morcell's portrayal of Adrienne, who ticks all the boxes of being likable, interesting, and compelling, is exactly the kind of game protagonist that's easy to identify and empathize with. Some of the performances do have a bit of hammed-up, softcore porno tone to them.
Hi, yeah, I'm Mike. Your caretakers let me in.
Oh, great. I'm going nuts without a phone.
Yeah, I can understand that. This is quite a place you got here, ma'am.
Adrian. Yeah, it is quite a place, isn't it?
But this is almost certainly a 100% intentional choice of direction, mimicking the 70s Italian giallo style of horror shock cinema, in which performers consciously overact and over-emote in exactly the same manner we see in Phantasmagoria, not to mention other beloved greats of the FMV genre. Yes, all of this tinny and bit-crushed video might feel a bit dusty and crusty in the cold light of 2025. But all of these different presentational elements added up to an enormous development budget for 1995. Sierra plunked down over $4.5 million in development costs for Phantasmagoria, plus another $1.5 million to build a special bespoke film studio specifically for this game. Sierra chose Peter Maris, the director of several forgettable late 80s and 90s action films, to be in charge of filming. They also brought on a professional special effects workshop, hired 25 actors to fill out the cast, and employed a 135-voice choir for the musical score. The combined price tag of $6 million was an absolutely unheard of amount of money and work hours for PC game development. And it came just off the back of the release of Wing Commander 3 in late 1994, which itself had a for the time biggest ever production budget of over $4 million. Now, a little perspective is extremely important here. The average Hollywood low-budget B-movie of the era could easily cost $8 to $10 million to bring to screens, or even more. Not only that, but if you inflation adjust the average budget of a modern AAA game to $90s, a $100 million development budget in 2025 works out to about a $47.5 million budget in 1995 when Phantasmagoria came out. So yeah, even though games like Wing Commander 3 and Phantasmagoria generated a lot of eye-popping headlines over their biggest ever budgets, the amount in absolute terms spent to realize that vision was a drop in the bucket held by a shoestring compared to what it costs to make games today. All of these outsized numbers might help explain why Phantasmagoria was an absolute magnet for controversy, due to its extreme gore, violence, and depictions of sexual assault. Parents groups and religious activists campaigned against Phantasmagoria over the usual corrupting our precious youth garbage, and as a result, the game was delisted from sale by several major retail outlets like CompUSA and of course banned outright in Australia and Germany. And to be fair, the player gets to witness some absolutely gnarly and gonzo gore that easily matches and exceeds those aforementioned classic Giallo-style exploitation flicks when it comes to the highly disturbing on-screen visuals. Even more infamously, Phantasmagoria was one of the main games targeted for scrutiny by Senator Joe Lieberman during the 1990s debate in the US over government censorship of video games. Fellow shithead conservative politicians Mitch McConnell and Mike Huckabee also indirectly blamed Phantasmagoria for a school shooting at the time because the regional school system had held stock in Sierra's parent company. Yeah, this was definitely a moment when the powers that be were aggressively trying to blame video games for absolutely every single societal dysfunction, just like they did with hip-hop or rock and roll music before that, or those penny dreadful novels that the Victorian underclasses wouldn't stop reading no matter how much the nobility shamed them. Tale as old as time.
You'll rot your mind playing games like that. Don't you know people who watch violence become violent themselves?
That's bullshit, Mom.
In the wake of all of this political pressure, Phantasmagoria ultimately served as a major impetus behind the creation of the US ESRB, the Entertainment Software Rating Board. It was the first ever game to receive an M for Mature 17+ rating under this new schema. But of course, we all know the Streisand effect. Trying to censor or shut down culture in this way only results in it becoming ever more in demand. There's no such thing as bad press, which was most definitely the case for Phantasmagoria as well. The game scored solid reviews and was an enormous commercial success, to the point where you almost have to wonder if Roberta Williams and the rest of her team were banking on the controversy, with the M for Mature warning label on the PC big box having a similar effect as the black and white parental advisory explicit content sticker on the latest 2 Live Crew albums. Williams has previously said in interviews that the outsized reaction to Phantasmagoria was unexpected and took her by surprise, but come on now. This was some of the most extreme and shocking imagery that had ever been seen in a video game in 1995. They knew what they were doing. It brings to mind titles like the first Grand Theft Auto or Palace Software's Barbarian for the Commodore 64, 2 games that self-consciously baited as much controversial press as possible, which in turn brought in substantially more eyeballs than would have ever been possible or financially feasible to reach via common marketing channels. Of course, another big reason why Phantasmagoria was so successful was that it's extremely easy to play. The game has a simple and intuitive interface that will be instantly amenable to point-and-click adventure fans. Novices will appreciate the inclusion of the talking hint skull, which does exactly what it says on the tin when you click on it. Provide a series of hints to the current puzzle, starting with opaque suggestions and then eventually just handing you the solution on a platter. Delivered with a wearied and exasperated tone, of course.
Someone in town holds the key.
These safeguards mean that the player can never really get stuck or soft lock and lose all of their progress, a common peril of other adventure games at the time, especially point-and-clicks created by Roberta and Ken Williams. Yes, in stark contrast to most of the rest of the Sierra game catalog at the time, the interface of Phantasmagoria is simple and most of the puzzles are even simpler. Almost every interaction in the game follows the familiar and well-worn adventure game grammar. Go here, talk to this person, inspect this, pick that up, examine it in your inventory, and then take it to another screen and use it. All of these interactions are performed via a streamlined one-click interface, no scum system or verb menu needed. But let's be clear, all of this streamlining does not mean that the game is necessarily simple or straightforward. Far from it, actually. This is a game that is deeply respectful to the player's intelligence and assumes that you're intuitive enough to observe clues and piece things together without needing to have everything spelled out for you in excruciating detail. One example. Adrian discovers a fully loaded cigarette case in a bureau early in the game. A few days later, if you inspect the cigarette case again, you'll see that one of the smokes is conspicuously missing. And later, as you explore the estate's hidden warren-like passageways that zigzag behind the drywall, you can find one of the stubbed-out cigs on the floor. At no point during this sequence of events does the game feel the need to rub things in your face with a hand-holdy infantile voiceover like, "Interesting, one of the cigarettes is missing from the case," or "Aha, here's that missing cigarette, someone must have smoked it recently." The game respects your intelligence and skills of observation so much that it's willing to risk some players not picking up on foreshadowing hints and piecing things together, which has the intended effect of making it that much more powerful and satisfying for the attentive player who does connect the dots of these observations. It also bears mentioning that on a purely technical level, this game actually looks great considering when it came out. While there is some bit crushing and pixelation on the FMV actors, there's very little blue screen fringing or color spill. The lighting on the characters is believable and matches whatever virtual space they're in, and the performers are always sized at the proper scale relative to their environment. That sounds very basic, and it kinda is, considering how so much of what we see on TV and in blockbuster movies these days is wall-to-wall green screens. But perspective is everything, because Phantasmagoria is an enormous design achievement considering the sheer novelty of FMV technology back in 1995, and especially considering how much more advanced soft and hardware for film production has become over the past decades. Even the artifacting of the FMV itself, the fuzziness, tinny audio, and bit crushing, also represents something of a technical marvel, because in order to meet that 700 megabyte per disc limit, the developers had to make expert use of compression and streaming tech in order to pack in all of the video clips, the still imagery and art, the music and sound effects, and the game logic that underpins everything. Part of the reason so many older games like Phantasmagoria have these huge, maximalist, skeuomorphic interfaces with a relatively small frame for the gameplay itself is exactly because of how it enabled the devs to reduce the processing load for all of this data down to a level that could be managed by your average home PC in 1995. This approach of addition through subtraction shines through in other elements of the game's design as well, like the absence of a score counter. There's no ticker for points like you see in so many other contemporary adventure games, particularly Sierra titles or the Tex Murphy series. Pretty much every part of Phantasmagoria operates from a vibes-first philosophy, and that's a purposeful choice meant to help the player further inhabit the role of Adrian, just like the cozy, low-stakes introductory chapter and humanistic idle animations. As Adrienne, the player's attention should be preoccupied by the unfolding gothic horror narrative that she finds herself embroiled in. The very last thing she should be worried about is running up the scoreboard and figuring out how to optimize the golden path. It's qualitatively and quantitatively different from, say, a detective game like Under a Killing Moon, where it makes perfect sense that you want to leave no stone unturned and rack up as many points as you can during your investigation.
Sorry, Mife. Can't help you there.
Phantasmagoria demonstrates how, far from being some kind of dead end for the adventure game, FMV games can be just as compelling and meaningful as their 3D and VGA counterparts by leaning into what makes them unique. To put a modern twist on that old axiom by Marshall McLuhan, with FMV games, full motion video is both the medium and the message. A big part of what makes Phantasmagoria so effective is the slow burn approach to storytelling. The game consciously does not throw the player into a tide pool of blood and guts right away. It instead spends more than half of its 6 to 7 hour runtime slowly ratcheting up the tension and general sense of unease before anything truly disturbing or gory imagery appears on screen.
Somebody here?
Which brings up an interesting point of contrast. Phantasmagoria is known infamously for its absolutely gnarly death sequences. You can find any number of gonzo compilations of this right here on YouTube. And yet, it's quite interesting how the player cannot die nor actually see most of the gore and violence until the final chapter of the game arrives, which naturally serves as the culmination and crescendo of every story thread the game has established. This violence and gore is excessive and tasteless, certainly, but it's also the furthest thing from gratuitous or unnecessary. These death scenes are not just here for pure titillation, although they accomplish that quite well too. They're executed this way and situated where they are within the game's narrative and mechanical pacing as an intentional artistic design choice. Somewhat legendarily, Roberta Williams penned a 550-page script/screenplay during the production process of Phantasmagoria. All of a sudden, that 7-disc packaging is starting to look a lot more necessary. As Williams said in a 2006 interview,
"In order for horror to succeed, the player needs to be passionate and committed. The buildup of suspense is all emotion. Being scared is gut-wrenching. Even though it's always been important to me that players would be personally committed to all of my games, it was even more important for them to become very emotionally involved with Phantasmagoria in order to create the suspense and terror necessary for a successful horror story."
All of this build-up and the deliberate way the narrative and characterization slowly unfold piece by piece and moment by moment, this was all done with a clear, intentional, creative purpose in mind. That is because the game's somewhat campy and hammer horror-inspired narrative parallels and is juxtaposed with a very serious and thoughtful tale of abuse and trauma, and how these forces can take on larger-than-life dimensions that can quite literally turn your life upside down and destroy everything you love. And it actually starts to get quite intense and unnerving to play through, even for someone like me who has become totally desensitized to most every form of horror media by now. See, after Adrienne opens that mysterious haunted box in the castle's hidden chapel, her formerly fun-loving husband Don begins to change. He starts becoming distant, angry, insecure, and dismissive at the drop of a hat, raging at Adrienne, belittling her personality, her hobbies, and her career, as though her success as a writer is somehow coming at the expense of his photography.
"I've got publishing deadlines, can you understand that? You see, I don't get the same ass-kissing royal treatment your publisher gives you."
Dawn?
He suddenly develops an excessive appetite for booze and cigarettes, getting blacked out on absinthe and passing out on the couch right there in the castle's main hall. He becomes possessive and controlling over how she goes about her day and who she chooses to spend her free time with, even going so far as trying to forbid her from leaving the castle and visiting the nearby town altogether.
"I thought I told you to stay away from all of those people."
People.
What people? Those stupid townspeople.
Oh, this is silly.
I'm not finished with you yet.
You're telling me what to do? Well, where were you all day?
None of your business, honey.
Well, I'll tell you what. You take care of your business and I'll take care of mine.
Well, we're gonna see about that.
From time to time, he also will seemingly recognize how he's behaving, offer a half-hearted gesture of contrition, and dangle the promise of reconciliation, only to snap right back into his old patterns of behavior as soon as Adrienne has been placated. And he gets more and more explosively violent, seemingly on a whim, destroying her laptop in a fit of rage and drowning her beloved pet cat in the backyard reflecting pool. And so, Adrienne is plunged into a state of pure emotional and physical desolation, trapped in an isolated and very possibly haunted Gothic castle, and utterly paranoid and fearful of what's happening to the man she pledged to spend the rest of her days with. Which can't help but raise the question for Adrienne, and by extension the player, has he always been like this, and I just never allowed myself to notice until now? It is excellent empathetic storytelling in service to a truly disturbing end goal, because experiencing all of this as the player leaves you with the exact same unanswered questions as Adrienne. You could easily read this as an allegorical version of events where Dawn was previously the perfect loving hubby, but being obsessed by the ghost of Carnavash that Adrienne released from the chapel is what drove him to madness. Or you could just as easily interpret the story as Adrienne arriving at the end of a rope with no supernatural assistance whatsoever, and finally recognizing her husband for the ugly, malicious, and manipulative person he really was all along. The signs were there. Again, the parallels to Stephen King in general and The Shining in particular are strong and obvious here.
You like my work?
Oh my God.
How do you like it?
Just like Adrienne, the player is likewise thrust into the state of destabilized detachment, where the security of the world you thought you understood has been upended because you can no longer recognize the person who you've built your entire life around. Which in turn becomes yet another reason to question your own judgment and perspective of events. A never-ending, perpetual motion machine of self-deception and self-loathing. The game's soundtrack also does a lot of emotional heavy lifting on this front. There are some very spooky MIDI tracks that play during the general exploration segments, which sound a bit like the prog rock noodlings of the band Goblin by way of comparison. But crucially, this exploration music the player hears while controlling Adrienne is all done with an extremely light touch, feeling even a bit sparse at times. By contrast, during the live-action sequences, things kick into a higher emotional register via audio from a live orchestra, including several highly operatic tracks that feature the voices of a dozen-strong chamber choir. The opening theme of Phantasmagoria is even a dead ringer for the Fortuna Imperatix Mundi suite of the legendary cantata Carmina Burana by Carl Orff. It all works extremely well, with musical accents helping to dictate the emotional peaks and valleys of the whole experience. Slightly eerie and understated background notes during the moment-to-moment gameplay, which are then juxtaposed against some epic symphonic bangers during the more dramatic FMV cinematics. This is exactly the sort of immersive and empathetic experience that is only possible through the medium of video games, where the story is not just presented to the passive viewer, but the player is made to become an active participant in the proceeding with all of the emotional weight that entails. Because everything we've described here so far, every single one of Dawn's behaviors and Adrienne's reactions, these are all clear, documented, well-recognized red flags for what it's like to be in an abusive relationship. What the player sees unfold across the narrative of Phantasmagoria is literally exactly what textbook patterns of verbal and physical abuse look like in a relationship, whether we're talking about a close friendship or a romantic partnership. Adrienne and Dawn essentially take on a toxic relationship dynamic, the sort of dysfunction that usually accumulates over the course of years and years, and speedrun it over the course of about a week. And this all comes to head right at the game's midpoint, where, in extremely disturbing detail, Dawn sexually assaults Adrienne. And let's not mince words here, what gets depicted on screen is by definition an act of marital rape. In the middle of some very awkward and not at all titillating sex, Adrienne starts becoming distressed. She practically shouts and waves high-vis semaphore flags at Dawn to hit the brakes immediately. But rather than stop or even slow down at her obvious anguish and signs of resistance, he continues on, apparently relishing in the distress he's causing her. Until it finally ends, and Dawn, seemingly overcome with the anguished self-realization of what he's just done to the person he vowed to love for the rest of his life, he flees the scene without offering so much as an "Are you okay?" This moment was the big one that triggered so much protest and political recrimination against Phantasmagoria, even more so than all of the gonzo violence. American politicians and activists of the era went so far as slandering the game as a rape simulator, which is an astonishingly bad faith reading of what this scene is expressing.
That scene is very essential to the plot. I knew it would be controversial and could have taken it out at any time, I kept it in because it was the pivotal point in the plot where Adrian suddenly realizes that something is terribly wrong with Dawn. Up to that point, she knows that Dawn isn't feeling well, but she attributes that to the bump on his head, or to stress from moving, or with his work. We knew that he's possessed by some sort of demon, but she doesn't. This is the way I wanted to let Adrienne know that something is very wrong with Dawn, and that he's capable of hurting her. I wanted her to start being afraid of him, and to abruptly kick her out of her comfortable world and into a world of horror. That scene does that. Without that scene, the rest of the story would make no sense. And yes, it was a sort of counterpoint to the lovemaking at the beginning of the game, where Dawn is normal, and we see that he loves her and is a really gentle person.
This whole pattern of abuse depicted in Phantasmagoria, up to and including the infamous rape scene, is an incredibly clear and effective depiction of how people in toxic relationships will often find ways to minimize bad behavior or convince themselves that they're just imagining things, even as the red flags pile up one after another. All of which is only further underlined by the supremely surrealist narrative of Phantasmagoria. Before the final 2 chapters of the game, it's never 100% clear whether a supernatural haunting is actually taking place, or whether Adrienne is hallucinating and cracking up due to cabin fever isolation, not to mention the ever-accelerating breakdown of her marriage. The whole game is an unsubtle, outsized, in-your-face allegory for how the downward spiral of abuse in a relationship is its own kind of haunting, the kind of horror that makes you doubt yourself and your worth as a human being. Until seemingly familiar and safe places like your own home become absolutely unrecognizable and indeed unsafe, pulling you deeper and deeper into a psychological labyrinth from which there is seemingly no escape. Just like how the profusion of off-kilter Dutch camera angles during the endgame sequence transforms the once familiar physical space of the castle grounds into a swirling maelstrom of confusion, with your possessed psycho-killer husband stalking you through the halls with Nicholsonian glee as acts of premeditated murder play out in his twisted brain pan.
Peekaboo! You're gonna come up and join the party? I think so. Come on, Adrian. Honey, I feel like making love.
The very title of the game itself has a similar degree of intentionality behind it. A Phantasmagoria was a late 19th, early 20th century term for a vaudeville show that made use of a rudimentary form of slide projector, known as a magic lantern, in the stage shows of the era, and some semi-transparent fabrics hanging at the sides of the stage and from the ceiling. This created the very effective illusion of spirits and ghosts floating alongside and above the house seats, who would then commune with the host and the audience. As you discover from your exploration of the castle, the former owner Carnavash was a vaudevillian who quite literally put on Phantasmagoria stage shows. If you ever had the chance to ride the Disneyland Haunted Mansion attraction before they revamped it in the mid-late 2000s, that was an encyclopedic example of an old-school Phantasmagoria. And what a pitch-perfect title this is for a game about a person being confronted on all sides by scenes of horror, leaving them feeling totally unmoored from reality. By the end of Phantasmagoria, as your poltergeist-possessed and fully Joker-fied husband beclowns himself with white face paint and goes on a rampage through the halls of the castle, the subtext has become the literal text. Yeah, all that "I'm going to become the Joker" shit ain't looking so cute now, is it? Once more for the people in the back, subtlety and subtext are for cowards. Adrienne is being menaced, chased, and threatened with extreme physical violence as she flees down the corridors of her haunted home. The themes on display here could not be clearer. And the only way to escape for good is for Adrienne to exorcise the demon that haunts her, i.e., destroy that motherfucker. By performing an occult ritual that can slay the both metaphoric and literal demon of abuse. After completing the ritual and banishing the Carnavash demon, the eldritch energies that bound the castle together begin to unravel, and the whole structure begins to collapse in on itself. Again and again and again, there is no subtlety to this imagery. Without the demon of domination to sustain it, the ornate facades of hierarchy and nobility are revealed to be nothing but a hollow shell that comes undone. At the end of everything, in the final scene, Adrienne emerges from the rubble of the castle looking like Linda Hamilton in Terminator, slowly stumbling through the wreckage. Here, the game has magnificently recapitulated the trope of the final girl in a slasher flick, but in an entirely new and downright subversive context. And remember, Phantasmagoria came out well before the discourse around horror media was sophisticated enough to recognize this for what it really was, and people finally began to appreciate the themes being expressed by movies like Halloween and Alien. Because freeing yourself from the deep trauma of an abusive relationship is never going to resemble a victory parade, or any other kind of triumphalist, badass march of freedom and liberation. You emerge scorched, blistered, hurt, and broken down. And after all of that struggle and heartbreak, this is the point where the real work actually begins. The long and grueling process of working through and overcoming the long-term pain that has accumulated from being trapped in a toxic relationship that has slowly but unwaveringly disintegrated your self-image and confidence from the inside. Just as it goes with the most memorable horror stories and legends, even when you conquer trauma, it has always a way of burrowing into your consciousness, rooting itself in your memory, and sticking with you for the rest of your days, always lurking and threatening to emerge again when you least expect it. Nothing like Phantasmagoria existed before it arrived on the scene, and truthfully, no game since has ever really managed to capture quite the same experience. Though there of course has been a magnificent FMV game revival over the last decade or so, and many of the biggest hitters on the list are more than worth the time of adventure game fans. Her Story and Immortality by Sam Barlow, The Infectious Madness of Dr. Decker, The Shapeshifting Detective, and there are even more interesting FMV games supposedly on the way over the next few years. There also was a sequel to Phantasmagoria released just a year after in 1996, subtitled A Puzzle of Flesh, which was intended to be the game that turned the series into an anthology. This one is much less well regarded than the first and was a total commercial flop, but honestly, after replaying it, I found there was a lot to love about it. It's actually quite a worthy sequel, not as a direct narrative continuation, but rather as a companion piece that picks up on so many of the first game's themes, but with a very different twist to it, just like you'd expect from a good anthology series. Stay tuned, because maybe this one will get the Video Essay treatment someday as well. Absolutely let me know in the comments if that's something you'd like to see.
Oh no, we're not even close to intense yet.
Phantasmagoria shows that FMV games are so much more than just interactive movies. It holds up so beautifully 30 years on that it totally puts the lie to the FMV games equals bad meme. The best of the best were dearly loved and critically acclaimed when they came out, and it's only in retrospect that the general audience has decided that they're a supremely cheesy and uncool artifact of ye olden times, and that FMV games are bad and we've always known it. It's just not true. In their moment, FMV games represented something entirely fresh, new, and supremely exciting. The powerful convergence of video games and cinema, which was an idea that was just a little bit ahead of its time. To this day, they still stand on their own merits as the ultimate thought exercise on the road not taken for the adventure game genre. As for the final word on FMV games and their legacy, well, perhaps it's best to give the floor to Roberta Williams once more.
I believe that most computer game designers who become involved with full-motion video games become enamored with the movie aspect of their game and lose sight of the fact that it is a game and not a movie. I believe, and the reviews and popularity of Phantasmagoria bear me out, that I was able to keep my objectivity to always stress the gameplay aspects of that project even when they interfered with the movie-like aspects of the project. Each game is different and has a different audience. You have to have an understanding of who you are writing a game for, and then write that game for them. The flow of the game will follow the storyline, the puzzles, and the characters, but most importantly, the person who you are writing the game for.
Thank you so much for watching. If this was your first video of mine, hey, I'm Ragnar, and on this channel I cover old games, indie games, horror games, and combinations thereof. And if you enjoyed this one, you'll probably find a ton of videos on games that might be right up your alley. Go check it out. If you'd like to support my channel, then engaging with the video of course helps a great deal. Leave a like, drop a comment, or subscribe, you know the drill. And of course the most substantial way of support is to join my fellow Patreon supporters with a monthly donation. It really helps out a great deal. On my Patreon, I also release backer-only bonus videos from time to time. You get access to the Patreon-exclusive Discord, and overall, you have my heartfelt gratitude in helping me keep doing what I love. So thanks a lot for considering, and as always, I'll say ta for now with a heartfelt shout-out to these lovely supporters. Thwagam, Billy Lott, Corey Marr, Henrik von Rensselaer, Shannon Blue, Dr. Haley Isabella Cawley, Amber Wiggins, Ari Orson, Alice N. HNG, Nathan Gillick, Uziel 1447, Gene, Sulmatul, Sunny Sky, Swiss Hackmod, Nineball 9606, Thomas Brunner, Righteous Itch, Gehennas, Alfred Correa, Vincent Kavanaugh, Aurora Melpomene Crescendo, Kyle Lee, Kerry George, Dana Rosa, Ronan Crom aka Daniel 242172, Casper Ram, Felix D, Aria, Link Hughes, Nikot the Brave, Zodi, Lucas Ferreira Leite, J.R. Smith, Vasily Prokhorov, Angelo Benedetti, Kenan Ward, Tabby, Giselle, John Boring, David Zelenak, Terraflops, Chuck Taylor, Hunter Crawford and Margaret Strawn, Sable Cowl, The Spiral Architect, Matt Gretton, Laird Wakala, Chrissy, Catherine Escobar, and Morrigan K. Until next time, ta-ta.